This Steve Jones Show podcast is now loading. The Steve Jones Show podcast is presented by Sunbury Motor Company, Purdy Insurance, and Brewers Outlet. Bringing you an in-depth look at Penn State sports and more. This is the Steve Jones Show on News Radio 1070 WKOK. The Steve Jones Show is presented by Purdy Insurance, Brewers Outlet, and Sunbury Motor Company. Now from the Sunbury Motor Studio, here's Steve Jones.
And this half hour being brought to you by our good friends at Purdy Insurance, Market Street in Sunbury. Go to purdyinsurance.com. We have lots of insurance needs: auto, home, life, business, boat, motorcycle, RV, just some of them. And we always, let's face it, when we have an insurance thing, we don't just have one, we have a bunch of them. And Purdy Insurance organizes all of them, make sure you're fully covered, and do everything they can because of customer service to make sure they save you money wherever they can. It is all at Purdy Insurance, Market Street in Sunbury. Go to purdyinsurance.com. It's always a pleasure to talk with the outstanding Adam Rittenberg. Sir, welcome. Great to have you back.
Great to be back, Steve. Hope you're doing well, my friend.
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. Adam, let's talk about New Orleans and Dallas. And I don't mean the cuisine. So let's get into what the SEC, the Big Ten, their meetings, which then led into the Dallas meetings. Is there any particular reason why something that on the surface seems simple of seeding 1 through 12 didn't get adopted in Dallas yet? What are the reasons behind that?
Well, we're still, again, just for this final year, dealing with a model where you need unanimous approval to change anything. And, you know, if you're sitting there and you're Jim Phillips or you're Brett Yormark or you're Gloria Nevarez and you're representing one of those other conferences and you see where this whole thing is going and you see the Big Ten and the SEC having these meetings and working together, which, again, is still a little shocking for those of us who have been around the Big Ten at least for a while, that's happening. You know, you can sense just the power grab and that continues to take place. And so even though, you know, they probably know that the next, you know, beginning in 2026, you're not going to have the exact model like we have right now where you do have those automatic buys for the 4 highest-rated conference champions. I get it to a degree that they would put their foot down and say, you know what, we're not going to give you that right now. We're going to keep it the way it is. It was still a successful playoff. Obviously, it benefits our champions to have that bye into the semifinal round, and we're not going to give in yet. So I guess that's the only thing I would say because it looked awkward, you know, with certain teams slotted the way that they did, and you could see the differences in talent when Penn State played in its quarterfinal and so forth. But those conferences are certainly looking out for their own interests, just like the Big Ten and the SEC are.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong about this. So, in other words, if you got the bye, like Boise State and Arizona State did, into the quarterfinals, that really was an $8 million payday and not $4 because of the bye. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe that's right too. So there's obviously a financial component as well to keeping it this way. But here's the thing that people need to know: like the system was always going to go through this first cycle of 12 years, and then it was going to change and potentially change dramatically. Now there was certainly momentum to increase the number of teams before the end of the cycle, and that's why we are where we are. Where we have this sort of 2-year gap where we have 12 teams, but we still have some of the old policies as far as governance and changing rules, needing unanimous consent. All those things are still in place until the end of this contract.
All right, so now the idea of going to 14 or 16, what's your sense as to, what might get discussed April and then in May about that? Because that's the transition time when they start looking ahead to 26 and beyond. Do you have any read on that, Adam?
Well, I think it's very clear that, the SEC and Big Ten would like that to gain serious consideration to increase the number of teams, because that will mean more access for those two conferences in all likelihood, and that's something that Tony Petitti, coming from Major League Baseball and having worked with all the professional sports and seeing the expansion of those sports from a postseason standpoint. He's talked to me and others about how it's hard to replicate that down the stretch feeling when your team still has a chance. And I think that a lot of people that weren't in college football looked at the sport from the outside and said, why is this thing so exclusive? Yes, you have this great regular season, but you have a bunch of teams and fan bases that are, essentially checked out by mid to late October. And by expanding the playoff to 12 and possibly to 14 or 16, you keep a lot more people engaged. And if you're a Big Ten or SEC fan, that's certainly a good thing, because as we saw even with this first system, your teams are going to gain more consideration for the at-large spots than teams from, say, the Big 12 or the ACC.
Then contracts are in place for conference championship games. What becomes of them in a in a playoff expansion, in your opinion?
Well, I think they'll still take place, but I think that those days are being looked at differently. Do we just have a conference championship game? Do we still have do we have another week of regular season football for the teams that don't meet in the conference championship to position themselves for the playoff? I mean, as exciting as the Big Ten championship game was this year, certainly for your listeners, Penn State being back there to take on Oregon, that was an entertaining game, as was the SEC game, which was a very close game, went into overtime. There was no drama as to whether those teams were going to get into the college football playoff. Now, there was drama as far as who would win and who would get that automatic bye, and Oregon and Georgia were those teams. But with the likelihood of that going away, most of those conference championship games are just going to be for that, the conference championship, not necessarily anything that matters beyond as far as the playoff, because both teams will have already qualified. And so if you're able to do more of a full slate and kind of a wild card weekend, so to speak, I could see there being some real appeal to that. Now, logistically, how do you do it? When are the games played and all of that? But, this is still a sport with a relatively short season. I was thinking about this in comparison to basketball. This basketball season, if you followed it from November to now, feels like it's gone on forever. And even though college football, the season is longer, it does seem to go by a lot faster. And so by adding another weekend of games, maybe not for every team in a league, but for those top teams that are trying to get into the college football playoff, that would be really exciting, I think, if it was done right, and add some drama, to a weekend that I think lacks a lot of it now.
The championship game this year was the 20th. I think this upcoming season it's the 19th, but the year after that, because of how the calendar works out, it's like the 25th of January. How important is it for them to look at the calendar so that this season fits, but it also fits dates the right way? Because they're not going to get any cooperation from the NFL. So, what about the date part of it?
Yeah, I think it's another discussion point. I think we did a project at ESPN a couple of years ago where we reimagined the calendar, and one of the things we settled on was to start the season earlier with bigger games and maybe bowl games at the start of the season as opposed to the end of the season. How can we figure out a way to wrap up the sport closer to where it was in the BCS era or even in the 14 playoff era, and not going through the entire month of January, because that obviously impacts the portal. It impacts coaching changes, both within the college realm and from college to the NFL and vice versa. So I think there's some real challenges, with the sport and the season getting longer. Is there anything that can be done as far as when the season starts? Do you do anything with Army-Navy weekend? Do you figure out a way to start playoffs earlier? For a long time, we would hear from the presidents, and they didn't want a conflict with final exams. I'm not hearing a whole lot of that anymore. So, because there's money to be made, as usual. I mean, college presidents, God bless them, and they're obviously very accomplished people, but they're at their core, they are elite fundraisers. And so if they're bringing money in, some of those other things seem to go by the wayside, and that's just the way it is. But maybe there is some flexibility there. I think you could certainly look at starting the season the last weekend of August, which is currently week 0, as opposed to after Labor Day or Labor Day weekend rather, and maybe you're able to shorten the end of the season as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've heard a lot about week 0. The other part is and this is something that's talked about a lot, but nothing's happened. For example, let's go talk to the NFL about scheduling Saturday regular season games against the playoff. Well, excuse me, over here in the back, who do you send? I mean, who's going to represent you? There's no commissioner of football. There's no commissioner of basketball. And so in this vacuum, Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti have stepped up in the vacuum. They've taken advantage of it. Is there any thought process about a commissioner for football, a commissioner for basketball, beyond just the thought of it?
Well, I think it's something that I laugh at first, Steve. Not at the question. It's a good question because it's something that's been talked about for a decade, and it doesn't seem to be any closer to truly happening. Even though there have been some massive changes in the sport, and it's something that again, I'm hopefully going to visit with Tony Petitti here again soon. It's something I like to ask him because essentially. If you're Tony or Greg, are you giving up power to that person? Like does that person serve you? Is it a person that serves your conferences? Right. Because there's there's sort of this chatter in the background about like who's looking out for the best interest of the sport, and it's kind of just shouted into the air and then disappears into the ether. Like it doesn't gain any real momentum. I think we all would like to see that. We would like to see some type of centralized college football body, or at least somebody who can advocate, who has respect. I mean, Nick Saban's name has been brought up. I think he would be a very effective commissioner of the sport. But is it something that the Big Ten and the SEC and the others could truly get on board with to support that person, not just to complain to that person? And would they give that person the power and authority and respect to do their job effectively? I mean, that's what it really comes down to. Otherwise, it's just a ceremonial title. I mean, I like Bill Hancock. He's a really nice guy, and he represented the college football playoff for a lot of years, but he didn't have the juice that Greg Sankey and Jim Delaney had. Anyone who covers the sport knows that they had much more power than the head of the college football playoff, and that would be my concern with the college football commissioner is this just a symbolic position, or is this somebody whose word and actions carry real clout?
I'm going to ask you about Greg and Tony in a moment, but I want to ask about the fact that in roster limits, it'll be 105 for football. We all know basketball is going to go up to 15. At 105, Penn State with walk-ons probably carried about 124. Right? Well, that's 19 fewer guys, and, of course, those are the walk-ons. Have you talked to coaches or even the commissioners about that? Because I've talked about, hey, look, I'm 5 on 105 with scholarships, but like a 15-person practice squad on top of that to keep that door open. But is there any even thought process about beyond 105, or is it too early for anybody to ask?
Well, I think it was hard to get to that number to begin with, and I think there's certainly sympathy towards those who are impacted negatively by it, but maybe there's opportunities then to play at a different level instead of being a walk-on. And I think coaches certainly are disappointed, and understandably so. And you look at the number of programs where walk-ons have had such a big impact on a game or a season or what have you, and what happens to those people here going forward. But yeah, it's obviously an item on a list that's growing and growing, given the realities of college athletics and the overall financial picture. But it's something that as commissioners, Greg and Tony have to pay attention to, just like the other commissioners, and coaches have to obviously work with what they have given to them. which is obviously the 105 number going forward.
Okay, and the final question for you, Adam, before I let you go, and thanks a lot for your time today. I really appreciate it. Tony Petitti, I've talked to a few times now, so I've got a general feel for Tony. Greg Sankey, I've never even been in the same room with, to my knowledge. So what kind of people are they in terms of how they relate to the sport and what you've picked up from each of them?
Yeah, it's interesting because, Greg is obviously, he's like a college sports lifer. I mean, his whole life has been as an administrator, at least professional life, in college sports. And so, he's been on the ground floor. He's been hands-on for his entire career, where Tony Petitti was involved in college sports from a television perspective for a number of years as an executive for different networks, but then really is much more of a pro sports person. And, I don't think this isn't a criticism of Tony, but I don't think Tony necessarily has the sentimentality about college sports of, maybe a Greg Sankey, but I'm thinking more so someone like Jim Phillips or like a career athletic director. He just has he's coming from the TV world, the pro sports world, and they look at things a little bit differently and maybe in a way that seems more business-oriented or callous, and you can use different words to kind of describe it, but Tony's obviously been very, very effective in his roles and has drawn very good reviews as Big Ten commissioner so far. I think what's just fascinating is their desire and enthusiasm to work together as the two big conferences, because that really wasn't the case. I think there was respect between guys like Jim Delaney and Mike Slive, but they weren't meeting and they weren't collaborating anywhere near what we're seeing now from the Big Ten and the SEC. Again, it's a little bit jarring as someone who covered the Big Ten and who looked at the SEC, that league did as a rival, to see them meeting a couple times a year and joining forces the way that they are.
Adam, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for the extra time you gave us today. Really appreciate it.
This winter has been cold, but Sunbury Motors Hyundai says, let's be alive in 2025 and heat things up with their huge selection of new Hyundais now. Hurry into SMC and drive away in a 2025 Hyundai Elantra for under $22 grand. That's right, a 2025 Elantra starts at just $21,728 with up to $1,792 off or 3.99% financing for 60 months. And there's 22 to choose from. 2025 all-wheel drive Hyundai Tucsons start at only $29,161. With up to $27,414 off or 2.49% financing for 60 months. And there's 42 available. Sunbury Motors continues to be this area's midsize SUV leader with up to $6,524 off the newly redesigned 2024 Hyundai Santa Fe's or 2.99% financing for 72 months, and they start at only $40,431. They have 5 that must go now. And all have America's best warranty. Sunbury Motors Hyundai in the North 4th Street Auto Plaza, Sunbury.